It's all yours.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I go by Jesse. Um, I'm an ANV member. Maybe I'm wrapping up the first 3 years, and I do make it to occasional events. And a little bit about my background. After college, I worked as an interpretive naturalist for a while, and then got a job with Fairfax County as an arborist. And the field was changing, and so at that time we sort of branched out into what we call urban and community forestry, because the field was sort of broadening. We weren't only focused on the individual tree. So I did that for about 30 years, and I've been retired now for about 10. But I still keep my hand in tree and forestry related matters to some degree. So what we're going to do is cover segments of tree related matters. And then what I'm going to try to do to stay kind of together with it and answer questions is try to deal with any questions that come in via each segment. And then we'll move on. And then at the end, maybe there'll be 10 minutes more or so to ask additional questions. And then last but not least, I have forwarded to Jean Raday, who's a volunteer in the main office, something I call a quick sheet. And what it is are bulleted tips on navigating how to deal with trees from getting a service provided, like with Arlington County, or dealing with misutility, and that kind of thing, as well as some other general tips. So if you would like that document, I sent it to her as an attachment. Just go ahead and get in touch with her. Her email is Jean with 2 N's and E on the end. And then her last name is Raday, Radday, all one word, at anvarlington.org. So if you'd like that attachment or doc, you can get it from her, or call if you get turned around on the email. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch in here. One of the things in the title of the program was listing all the benefits of trees. And one of the ones that I think is most important is the air quality benefits that we get from trees, particularly in urban and suburban areas, particularly a big issue. What trees do is they pick up particulate matter in the air from pollution, and they store it. They also pick up gases that are in the air through their leaves. And it'd be interesting to know how they deal with all this and not get sick or stressed, but seemingly they don't. The areas in our country that seem to do this the most are rural areas. It's kind of figures because that's where there's a lot of trees and vegetation. And that's countrywide. In 1 year, one large mature tree can absorb 48 pounds of carbon dioxide. That's amazing when you think about it. And as far as the trees that do this the best, it's recommended that you have a combination of evergreens and deciduous trees on your property. Evergreens clean the air all year because they don't lose their leaves. They have needles. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit. So that's the only other thing I want to say about air quality in trees. There have been a lot of studies about health problems today from the lack of trees in urban and suburban areas, as well as, I guess, changes in our health relating to that, the air quality. And it's being noted that there's a lot more people with asthma today than there were 50 years ago and beyond. And that's another important reason, among many, to try to maintain trees and keep them in our communities. As far as enjoying them, because that was in the title of the talk, I mean, we could talk all day about how to enjoy them, but one of the things I like to do is to go check out unique trees when I travel. Because where we live in Northern Virginia in the mid-Atlantic, we have trees that are native to here and then some that have been planted, many. But you go, say, to New England or you go to the West Coast and they're different. And so what I like to do, how I enjoy them, among other ways, is to go check those other species out. And I'll read about them in advance sometimes. So that's one thing that you should think about. Okay, so we're going to talk about basic tree care for large trees. Somebody asked me before I started my talk how to deal with trees that people are paranoid about, relating to them falling in storms or just whatever, they get sick, diseased. And so here's my recommendation. If you have large trees on your property that are within striking distance of your home, your neighbor's home, or a driveway, or the street, as long as it's not in the right of way, because trees in the right of way are dealt with by Arlington County, or even trees that could fall or a limb could fall in an area of your yard that's frequented a lot, I would recommend you hire a private arborist. They're very readily available, and they will evaluate the overall health and the structural integrity of the tree. What's the deal with the structural integrity, you ask? Well, trees, depending on their species, can have any number of structural deficits that aren't apparent to a layperson. How the tree grew, the species of it could have a role there. And over time, impacts from storms could affect a tree also. Then there's the below grade in the soil where problems can begin to occur that could affect the stability of a tree. So the best thing to do, if you have never done it before and you want to feel better and get clear on the health of your trees and their stability, is to hire an arborist. Well, how do you go about that? Well, it's not that hard. There are two organizations in the Mid-Atlantic area. One is run by the International Society of Arboriculture, and their their website address is www.goodtreecare, all one word, .com. And you can go in there or get help going in there and find some in Arlington or nearby and ask who might be interested in coming to meet with you and consult. There's a fee. I would recommend that you pay for it and not just have them come by and sort of willy-nilly kind of, oh, I think we could help you with this, and they don't really drill down very far. Ask them to evaluate the tree or trees. The other organization is the American Society of Consulting Arborists, also known as ASCA. And their website is www.asca.com, I believe. And those individuals are registered arborists. It's a little different. Their credentials are a little different. And they're more consulting oriented. And then you have, cross fertilization between both organizations. So I would recommend that. And that way you'll know, do I have a tree that's healthy? Does it need pruning? Should it be removed? Does it need some care beyond pruning? Maybe some minor fertilization or treatment for pests? You want to get 3 estimates. If an arborist recommends work, and many times they will, because it's hard to have a tree that's in perfect health all the time, they will give you an estimate, and you can talk to them at length about it. And I recommend a minimum of 3 estimates. One other tip: when the work is going on, should you hire somebody and the work is going on your property, do not stay out in the yard. Stay inside. There have been property owners injured and once in a great while killed by standing in the yard during tree work, because the people that are doing the work aren't always worrying about what's going on in the yard. They're focused on the tree and their safety too. So just an important tip. As far as general care that you can do, that's not complicated. A lot of people mulch their trees. You don't need to mulch an established mature tree. I've seen trees in our area that have been mulched, and mulch, particularly a lot of it, damages and injures a tree. You want to have the trunk come down to grade and flare out. You don't want it covered with mulch. There's a tree nearby here where I live in Arlington that's got at least a foot of mulch up around the trunk. And it's been like that for a while. The tree's still doing okay, but it maybe would do better without it. Another thing that you can do that's real easy to do, I did it this year, is during extended droughts, go ahead and water a little bit. You don't have to water a lot, but a little bit. I've got a holly on my property that's very touchy. And so I watered it twice this past late summer and fall when we weren't getting any precipitation. And I watered underneath it and all the way out to the edge of the canopy. And I probably didn't run the hose longer than 10 to 15 minutes, but I made sure I got the whole area and just enough, to get it a little water. And again, wasn't sure when it was going to rain next. So that's easy to do. Couple other things you can do for trees also. An arborist can do this for you, or you can do it, is particularly if you're living in a newer home and there's been construction damage or construction activity on the property, is you can have something called mycorrhizae put into the soil around the tree. And what mycorrhizae is basically a tiny little fungus that grows on the tiny little root areas of a tree. below grade in the soil that has a symbiotic relationship with the tree, meaning it provides something to the tree and then gets back something. And what it provides to the tree is the ability to allow the tree to have a stimulation to its root system for better uptake of nutrients. And it also allows the root system to develop more so. I don't recommend you doing this just outright. I recommend this more for trees that are either stressed, or you believe, or that you've been told it's stressed, or if you're living on a piece of property where there's been construction damage or construction activity where the root system may have been damaged some. You can buy this stuff online or at a nursery. Okay, so the only other thing I can tell you about caring for trees is some arborists will have a credential called TRAC, which stands for having a brain drain. Tree. You know what? I'm going to come back to that. For some reason, I don't want to take up time. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. So I'm going to write myself a note. I'm forgetting what it stands for. I know what it means. Okay. So issues relating to mature trees broadly in Northern Virginia. Many of you have probably never heard about the Dillon Rule. What the Dillon Rule is in Virginia is a requirement that jurisdictions not be allowed to enact certain types of regulations and laws unless it's approved by the state and or the General Assembly. So what it means is powers that are expressly granted by the state. So for about 30 years, there have been a number of attempts to try to get tree conservation and preservation legislation adopted in Virginia, and it's always been shot down. In the 90s, we actually did get what's called enabling legislation that will allow jurisdictions to require during land development and construction either planting of trees or preserving of trees, or a combination of the two to meet the requirements. Developers bought into that. They like that. So that's what we have. That legislation, I think, was modified slightly some years ago. And last but not least, a jurisdiction can choose whether or not to adopt that or not. That's how it works. So the other challenges we have in Virginia and Northern Virginia is just construction and land development. We lose trees because if you preserve them, what happens is many of them won't make it. Their root systems expand a lot further than you would think. They often go beyond the edge of the canopy, sometimes quite a ways. So that's been a challenge for us in Northern Virginia. Another challenge we've had, and this is kind of new, is in the last 5 to 6 years, we've had something called oak decline. Have you all heard about it?
Okay. Yeah, we actually have a question about that.
Okay. I can't see the questions right now. We'll stop after this segment and answer a couple. Oak decline is something arborists kind of had to get their arms around. And what it is, it's extremes in dry weather, drought, and flooding, and very wet weather, they think, where trees get stressed from the extremes. And when they get stressed, then they're more subject to disease and pests. And in some cases, if the rain and the flooding is bad enough, they can develop root rot. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I haven't heard, but I don't know that there's much we can do about the weather. We're also dealing with more severe storms today, largely driven by climate change. We've always had them. They always beat up trees, but it's more severe and more intense, and even to some degree, maybe more frequent. Last but not least, we have in some jurisdictions either a lack of adopting legislation that would help protect trees, and legislation that's either sustainable or is environmentally oriented. And when that happens, and it's relating to development and building, and you have not thoroughly thought out legislation and zoning, that's extremely damaging. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute, and I got what TRAQ means. It's Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. TRAQ, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. I would recommend if somebody has a tree that they believe is really questionable or it's been brought to their attention, there's a problem of some type, somebody with a TRAQ qualification, who often it can be a certified arborist or an ASCA registered arborist, will have that credential. Okay, so we're going to answer some questions right now. I went through 2 segments. I can't see the questions. I think under the chat, I'm pulling up, let's see, I'm going to go to the top. Okay.
So if you want, I think the first one is you were talking about structural integrity.
Right.
And there's a comment here about the former mayor of Alexandria, right, loving Bradford pears, planting them, and then discovering how likely they are to split and drop branches.
Right. So I don't know how that happened, because Alexandria has an arborist, actually more than one. So I don't know how that happened.
Vola Lawson, that's how it happened.
What was that?
Vola Lawson insisted.
Really?
Yeah. She
Even if
loved those
she was
trees.
advised otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, we took care of that question.
On a related question, are there other trees like that that you would say, do not plant this in your yard?
Yes. Norway maple, those Bradford pear or calorie pear cultivars, because there's several cultivars in the Bradford pear sort of category that are planted. But aside from those, I would not plant Norway maple, and there's several cultivars of that as well. Other than those 2, as far as trees go, I think those are the main ones in our area that are invasive. There are some, and again, if we have time, we're gonna get into tree planting at the end. But there's certain, with tree planting, it's got to be the right tree in the right place. So some trees could be a great tree, again, not invasive now, but you planted it in the wrong place. And that's an item that we'll leave for the discussion on tree planting. Next question, when is it time to get a tree professionally deep fertilized? Is it too late in the season now? Mature established trees don't necessarily need to be fertilized. If they're healthy, I don't recommend it. Now, if there's a problem of some type, and I'll give you an example of one quickly. I have a holly on my property, great big one, American holly. I'm staring at it right now. And this tree is affected a lot when there's heavy rains, because the rains change the pH of the soil. They need acid soil. And it also washes away other nutrients. So what I do is I do a slow release fertilizer. And I do it myself. You can buy, fertilizer for hollies. And you may not have a holly on your property, so this wouldn't apply. But again, in general, if you have mature trees and they're healthy, you don't need to fertilize them. Okay, anything on the demise of the oak trees?
Well, before you go on, somebody pointed out that the correct website for ASCA is asca-consultants.org.
Okay, good. Thank you.
ASCA.com is for Australian sheepdogs.
Got it. Okay, great. That's in my quick sheet also. So, great. When is the best time to oak trees? And we talked about that. Again, it's the strange issue with extremes in weather, flooding and drought. As far as the legislation, the Dillon Rule, which is established state law, is the challenge to being able to get a jurisdiction enabling legislation that they submit, and getting a sponsor to do that to the state. So that's the Dillon Rule. You're not going to go anywhere if you can't get a sponsor and the General Assembly doesn't support it. A surge in oak mite infestations. Would this be related to the oak decline? I have to claim a little ignorance there. I'm not familiar with the oak mite infestation. I'm not saying it doesn't occur, but I'm not familiar with it.
Now we have a prior question. What's a good tree to plant on the strip of ground between the street and the sidewalk, bearing in mind the possibility of utilities passing through there? And my addition to that is that even legal, since that's the county right of way, right?
Right. So you don't want to plant trees in that area. Flowers, but I don't recommend trees for a whole range of reasons. Plant them on your property. And if they're close to a sidewalk, you need to be careful with respect to overhead utilities, even if it's on your property, as well as underground utilities. And we're going to try to get into that for a few minutes when we talk about tree planting. Another question was a book, Finding the Mother Tree. It follows her research and how she discovered that trees communicate and share nutrients. Yes, that's a fabulous book. And they knew about mycorrhizae before that, but she, through her research and study, sort of confirmed that. It's amazing how far-reaching root systems are. I had a locust that had to be cut down, and new locusts popped up about 25 to 30 feet away from the main tree. I have seen that and also seen it on my property. I need to look into that more. That's sort of it strikes me as invasive, but locust is a native tree and a good tree in many ways. Maybe not in all ways, but it's a good tree in some ways. And I believe it might even be a host plant for some butterflies. Let me see if I can find that here real quickly. Yeah, it's a host plant for the silver-spotted skipper, which is in our area. Okay, let's see. The county seems to plant small trees at times in that strip. Looks good for a while. Well, that's the county planning in the right-of-way where they have authority. They're trying to plant urban trees where, in that particular case, they've studied the underground and underground utility situation. And they've also done a range of engineered components to get them planted in those locations. Sometimes you actually need to do engineering in order to make that work. But generally, I don't recommend homeowners and property owners planting in the right-of-way. Okay, I'm devoted to the American elm in Oakland Park, Virginia Square. It's about 100 years old and has Dutch elm disease. In touch with the county, shown some interest. But to do finally has to be cut down. I'm looking like who might join with me to make sure we celebrate the life of this tree. Anyone is welcome to call me. And I will call you because I'm not that familiar with that tree, but would like to know more. So I'm going to jot your phone number down.
Well, that is exactly what I was hoping for, Jessica.
Okay.
Gary and several others on this call know that I am a person that gets a vision of something and we want to take care of it. This is for those in Virginia Square. The reason that we have a beautiful park is because of this tree. But since the time that they redid the park 8 years ago, we knew the tree is not going to be there forever. But I just don't want to see it, cut down in the dark of night and ground up and turned into mulch.
Yeah, and I'll call you pretty quick on that because you need to kind of head people off at the pass, as they say.
What I think I've done that successfully, but anybody else who would like to be in this group, Nancy, Pax, Gary, I hope that we're going to get Dolores. I hope we get some of the usual suspects and maybe some new people interested. What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, that'll count me in.
Okay, so Anita's phone number is on the chat if anybody wants to call her.
Elm Tree 2024.
Okay, so we're going to move on.
Jessica, before you do, we have one last question.
Okay.
She's asking, should all of the suckers be cut away from the main trunk of a crabapple? And why do they put out so many? Is it because the tree is stressed, or what's going on there?
There could be any number of things going on. Usually on non-ornamentals, crabapple's an ornamental, but with non-ornamentals, that's not a good sign. With ornamentals, it may or may not be a good sign. And it's the kind of thing an arborist would need to look at to say for sure. You might Google that and see if there's any information online about that. Right off the cuff, I'm not familiar with that issue, but that doesn't mean there may not be one.
Do you have
But,
any advice on how to remove those suckers without damaging the tree?
Yeah, I mean, you can remove them very carefully without, as long as they're not real big, by carefully taking a handsaw and cutting, but making sure you cut just to the outside of what's called a branch collar, even though a sucker is not really a branch. But in the process of cutting the sucker, you don't want to cut the edge of the tree. So you got to be careful where you do that. That's pretty important. Okay, so we're going to move on. We're going to talk about holiday/Christmas trees for a few minutes. And then depending on the time availability, we're going to talk about tree planting. Okay, so some people buy live trees every year. I do. I've been doing it with my parents since I was a little kid. Most of the live trees that we have in our area come from the mountains and the valleys of the Carolinas, Southwest Virginia, Western Maryland, and Western to Central Pennsylvania. That's where most of them come from. There are a few tree farms an hour and a half, 2 hours from here. If you want to drive, make that drive. I went to one near Frederick, Maryland, about 3 or 4 years ago. And then there's some that are in the direction of Culpeper and Charlottesville. If you do that, there's usually people there at that business that will help you cut the tree down, because it's a little rigorous process. You have to get down almost on your knees and saw, and it's a production. For those of you that opt to get a live tree, here's what I recommend. Make sure when you purchase it, the organization or the business removes about 1/2 inch off the bottom of the trunk. What that does is it allows the tree, when you get it home, to uptake water more readily. Remember, a lot of these trees that you buy at stores or at nonprofits have already been cut down when you see them for at least 6 weeks usually. And they're beginning to dry out a little bit. So you need to, be careful with that. Get the thing home and put it in water right away. Even if you don't bring it in your house immediately, put it in water. Get a big bucket or pail and just plop the trunk right in there. And lean it up against the house or something else that'll allow it to stay upright. I don't bring my tree in until about a little over a week to a week and a half before the holiday. I try to keep it outside where it's cooler, it's damper, and I also spray it. I mist it each day. You can do that when you bring it inside. That's critical. That I personally think you should mist it each day. And again, when you get it in the stand, make sure that you keep water in that stand, because you're going to notice the tree's going to, as it, because it's warmer, dramatically warmer in your home, it's going to start to take up that water. So make sure you keep the water filled up in the stand. Some people use preservative, and you can do that. There's a number of different products out there. I usually use a little bit of preservative. However, be really careful with that stuff because it can stain. So if you spill some on your nice wooden floor or your carpet, good luck. So be careful. Let's see if there's anything else here. Safety. How could I overlook that? That's probably one of the most important things when you have a live tree. When you put it up, don't get it anywhere near a fireplace that's being used, nowhere near it, or a heat source. That'll tend to dry it out more. And logically, don't put it where candles might be lit. For the lights that you use on it, make sure you use up-to-date light strings. You know, mostly what's sold today is very updated. But there are folks that hang on to older strings of lights that still work. Make sure you check that and put some thought into it. And maybe consider, if you have an older light string, maybe older than 10 years, maybe ditch it. And if you're not sure, look into it. When you're away from your home for any length of time and at night, I recommend unplugging it. Don't run the electrical cords underneath carpeting. And try to plug the tree in and the light into up-to-date outlets. If you don't feel comfortable putting lighting on the tree, don't. You don't have to. You can still decorate the tree. Here's a final tidbit on the US Capitol Christmas holiday tree. It just went up, it got lit last night in front of the Capitol. This is different from the national tree. The Capitol tree came from West Virginia this year, from a little community way in the Monongahela National Forest, next to a little town called Glady. And it's a 60-foot Norway spruce. Norway spruce are not native, so that tree probably was planted 60 years ago. And the selection of it was based on the fact that it had nice form and it was healthy. The Society of American Foresters partnered with the USDA Forest Service to sponsor the tree, which probably means paying for its delivery. It also drove around the state for a while before it was brought to DC. So unless there's any questions about holiday trees, let me check the chat. The question about non-functioning lights, I think Mom's Organic Grocery or Langston Boulevard will recycle them. Great topic. Great item. Thank you for sharing that. That's very important. You know, if you could not ditch them in the trash and recycle them. So Mom's on Langston Boulevard. Great. Okay.
Bessie, what about buying a Christmas tree with the roots on it that you can plant after the holidays?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks for bringing that up. I've done that twice. And I bought a blue spruce, balled and burlapped. The first one was pretty good sized, and I had to have a big container in the house to put it in, and then something underneath it so that when I watered it it didn't spill out. If you do something like that, you need to make sure that you water that root ball really heavily before you bring it in the house. And then don't bring it in till a week, 10 days before the holiday. And then after the holiday, don't wait a long period of time, get it outside and plant it. There's some risk that they'll be able to get established. it depends on the weather a little bit and how healthy that tree was when it was purchased. Again, mist it, water it well before you bring it in, water it while it's in the home, and then make sure you plant it properly. 2 of these trees that were Colorado blue spruce made it. But there's no guarantee because that's a little risky. Okay, so we're going to move into tree planting unless there's any other questions. I
Nope.
think we've got what, 10 minutes?
Mhm.
Okay. A lot of these topics we could talk about forever. So these pieces of information are cursory. With tree planting, you want to get into the right tree in the right place. A couple examples. I love yellow poplar or tulip poplar. It's fabulous for all kinds of wildlife, provides a lot of shade when it's big. However, this is a tree that gets very, very large eventually. And it's also what we call weak wooded, meaning that it self prunes its branches. Now, when I'm talking about branches, I'm not talking about gigantic ones. I'm talking about ones that are probably an inch in diameter or branchlets, but it does that a lot. So that's a tree you don't want to have close to your home and maybe not even on your property. That might be a tree that's better in a park or a natural area away from where people frequent. So that's an example of one issue. Another example of right tree, right place. You need to respect your neighbor's property line. And a lot of people will plant trees on the property line or close to it. And I don't recommend that at all. Plant them a ways from the property line. If you really, really want to get something close to the property line, plant a small tree or a shrub. The best time is the fall to plant trees. Trees are going into dormancy. It's much less stressful on them. And then when they start to, do their thing in the spring, they're already settled. They're not as in the shock as much because tree planting is a shock to trees. So focus on the fall. A lot of people in business push tree planting in the spring. And you can do tree planting in the spring, but it's harder on the tree. And then you've got to water it all the way up till Thanksgiving, unless we have heavy, moderate rain. That's an important tidbit. Let's say you buy a tree and you plant it early September, kind of going into fall. Unless there's heavy rains, you need to water that tree all the way up till Thanksgiving. A lot of people think, it's fall, I don't need to water it. No, that's not true. The tree's trying to maintain, adequate hydration to get it. It's kind of like a version of antifreeze, sort of, that gets the tree through the wintertime. Whenever you can, use native trees. I like ornamentals, which are non-native mostly, but I also focus on natives. There are a number of natives you can get. A true native is one that was propagated from a wild tree seed. That's a true native. And there's 3 places you can get true natives in our area. One is Earth Sangha in Springfield. Another is the Virginia Native Plant Society plant sales, usually at Green Spring Farm Park in Annandale. And also Nature by Design is a third place that will propagate from seed, native seed. As we talked about earlier, critical before you plant that you call misutility. Misutility is a kind of a requirement the power company and the gas company together have, that free of charge, they will come to your property and mark where your utilities are. They're particularly concerned about buried power, electrical power, and gas. But they will also mark other things too sometimes, or often, like cable. In my yard in North Arlington, I have my power up above. It runs to a power pole, and also my cable is above ground. My gas is buried. That's pretty typical. So whenever I call misutility, and I don't do it routinely, but when I do, they mark that gas line, and it's good for the contractor to see that. The number one thing you want to do if you have overhead power is make sure the contractor, because they'll vary in their awareness, knows where the overhead power is. You don't want to have a situation where somebody has a long shovel or some kind of pole and they accidentally hit it. There was one thing I did not mention earlier, and I want to mention it now, and then we're done. Conflicts with neighbors on existing large trees. I meant to hit that and I didn't. There's a lot of conflicts that occur amongst neighbors with large, big trees. Many of those were not trees that were planted, although a few were here and there, but many are not. And they pose varying challenges. So the first thing you really want to do is have a conversation with your neighbor. You know, it can be a relaxed chat. Get clear on what their concerns are if they've expressed it to you, or you need to express it to them. Take a photograph or a number of them of the issue, and then think about hiring a private arborist to look at the tree and evaluate what, if anything, is a concern. The arborist will make any recommendations on what, if anything, can be done, or, you know, what it might cost. And if you're willing to do it, ask them to prepare a report that you have, that you can use for any number of ensuing issues that may continue. And then if the recommendation is to remove the tree or to prune it, at least it's clear what needs to be done, if anything. And then last but not least is hiring an attorney. And you don't want to do that if you absolutely don't have to. But there are attorneys in the region that you can consult with. And there are a few arborists that are very trained just in that area. Tree law. Last but not least, a tree on the property line where the trunk is on the line is co-owned. A lot of people don't know that. I mean, it's kind of logic, but so if a tree is on the property line, it's co-owned, the trunk. Okay, so let me see if there's any questions on that.
I had one question related to something you said at the beginning. You talked about looking at trees in other parts of the country when you're traveling. There are a million birding books out there. Are there books on trees that you would particularly recommend?
To see?
Yeah, to identify trees or read
Well,
about.
there are a lot of field guides in different parts of the United States. So that would, you could even get them at the library, some of them. But yeah, you could buy some. There's a lot of information online too. The other thing that's kind of neat, there's a book that came out about 6-7 years ago called The Wild Trees. And it's a book by Richard Preston, where he gets into a discussion about this very thing, about some unusual trees in different parts of the world. Australia was one, and then a long discussion about the redwoods in different places along the northwest coast of California mostly. But I mean, the sky's the limit. There's many books out there. You just have to kind of poke around. What I would recommend without having to spend any money is go to the library and go to the section that's got tree books, natural history books, and just scope to see what you see. You can do a Google search too. Like, let's say you're going to Texas and you want to see anything unique there. Google Texas trees or unique trees in Texas, for example, and you might get some topics of books that come up. I actually think that would be a really cool book if somebody took it and then took segments of different parts of the country, kind of like a travel guide or whatever, to discuss special or unique trees in different regions. Because I've done that, but being an arborist and a forester, I kind of, am drawn to that, so I do it. But anybody can, and just in the United States, I mean, we have so many trees that are special, I think, and that are unique. And then when you get into other parts of the world, it's the same thing. Let me leave one quick story with you about that. There's a tree in South Carolina called the angel oak. And this tree is about a half hour west of Charleston, South Carolina. And this tree is at least 500 years old, at least, and is not extremely tall. I mean, it's tall, but the breadth on it is shocking. And if you ever get down to Charleston or thereabouts, go see the angel oak. It changed me as an arborist and forester when I saw this tree, and I'm not kidding you. It was a spiritual experience. I highly recommend it. Okay, unless there's any other questions.
Well, there are a few, but I wanted to ask if we don't get to everything. Can people email you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a few emails. Don't broadcast my email everywhere, but I'll share it with the group. Let me put it in the chat.
And I'll read a few comments. Liz said there's a really good tree tour of the Capitol.
Okay.
Tree guides. Somebody recommended David Sibley's tree book.
Yep.
And somebody else recommended Melanie Chukas Bradley's City of Trees, which
Yes.
is about Washington's trees,
Yep.
and Common Native Trees of Virginia from the Virginia Department of Forestry.
Yeah, there's so many. It's kind of like I have some of those books. Those are good books. But there's so many. It depends on what your angle is. If you're trying to do identification, that's one thing. If you're trying to understand what to plant, it's another. I like DIRR, DIRR, for planting or getting background on trees more. But you need his latest edition because earlier editions had loads of invasives in it. So you want to use the latest edition. I mean, the sky's the limit. There's many.
So Jessica, thank you so much. I can't help but think, as I was listening to you during that, I had one quick thought, and that was going out to California and seeing the giant redwoods and
Yeah.
the sequoias. I
it's
remember
incredible.
ironically making a report about that when I was in 5th grade. And so it was a thrill to actually travel out there. It's a little far from the Northern Virginia area, but certainly something to go and see if you have a chance. So,
Absolutely.
but this was great. I can see a number of attendees here are giving you an applause for an
Okay.
excellent.
Well, thank you for
It
inviting
was
me.
really good.
It was an idea that Jean Rudet and I had in a conversation, and then I offered to do it. So
Cool.
thanks so
It's-
much, and have a
Okay.
good holiday. And email me, but please don't broadcast my email if you have a question. Don't broadcast.
Okay. Well, and I want to thank Jessica Strother again for this presentation and remind everybody that next week we're going to be getting into the holiday season. Our guest is local author Michelle Braffman, and she is going to talk about her recently published novel called Swimming with Ghosts. So it sounds like an opportunity to hear, something again, a little different, just like today talking about trees. So I hope that everybody will tune in a week from today, December 6th, Wednesday at 10 o'clock. And so until then, stay warm, and we'll see you next week.